Welcome to Toward a More Jewish Jesus, the Interfaithfulness podcast, where Christians and Jews discover that we have far more in common than we ever imagined. Each week you will find new ways to move forward in relationship with the Jews and Christians you encounter, know, and love. My name is Steve Lamb, and our host is Dr. Stuart Dauermann, Director of Interfaithfulness. Let's join Stuart now for today's discussion.
Shalom, welcome again to Toward a More Jewish Jesus, where everything gets better when people get together around a more Jewish Jesus. We're a podcast from Interfaithfulness, and at the Faithfulness, we're your consultants and your problem solvers at the intersection of the Christian and Jewish worlds. That's what we deal with, the intersection of the Christian and Jewish worlds. And one of the problems at the intersection is that people make assumptions about each other that are not necessarily very nice, but they're unquestioned as well. Before I go any further, I've got to have better manners than this. Let me say hello to Steve Lamb. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Stuart.
How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
That's good. It's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Good. So let's get back to this issue. People make assumptions, and I'm afraid that in both the Jewish and Christian worlds, there are some unflattering assumptions that Christians make about Jews. And let's face it, there are some unflattering assumptions that Jews make about Christians. And the problem is that people don't necessarily know that their assumptions are not only unflattering, but really not true, because they don't really ever reconsider them, you know?
It's very interesting. I'm on a lot of Jewish groups and a lot of Christian groups on Facebook.
Yes.
And it's amazing to read some of the things that the groups are saying about each other that if you have a foot in both worlds, you go, that's untrue. Well, that's untrue. And, you know,
I've been doing that for 50 years. I am a consultant and a problem solver at the intersection of the Jewish and Christian worlds. And I want to look today at something. This came up last week on Facebook. You mentioned Facebook.
Yeah, there we go.
Kind of ubiquitous now. On Facebook, there was some discussion, and some guy jumped into the discussion. I remember what it was about. It was about the fact that there are some Aaronic priests, people who are descended from Aaron, who are in Israel now being trained to exercise the priesthood should the temple be rebuilt.
Right.
And this guy, who was not a Jew, rang in and said that this is terrible, and that all of this is now defunct. But his whole attitude towards Judaism, the statements he made about Judaism were that Judaism has now been replaced by something else. Jesus is coming and starting a new religion. Judaism is a soul-destroying religion and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, well, wait a second, though. Is he allegedly a Christian?
He would not say allegedly, and I believe he is.
Yeah. Well, so then he has read, one hopes, the book of Revelation, where it talks about the temple being rebuilt and sacrifice being made again?
Well, actually, I think you'd get that more from Ezekiel than Revelation. But he's read these things. But people read things through the lenses of their own presuppositions. And I want to deal with something that he threw at me, that I get thrown at me once in a while. Maybe it gets thrown at you. And maybe you're even a thrower. And it's that the letter to the Hebrews tells us clearly that with the new covenant, the old law is passed away. We got a whole new ballgame. Now, that may not upset some of you, but it sets off alarm bells in my mind. And I've got to tell you a story before we get into this discussion. It's very related to it. When I did my PhD, I was obliged to do some study in the letter to the Hebrews. And it occurred to me that these Jews who received this letter, they're called the Hebrews, you know.
Oh.
These Jews...
They weren't the Italians?
Well, they may have been Italian, but if they were Italian, they were Italian Jews.
Okay.
And these Jews, I realized they had to think of themselves as a Jewish community. Almost all Christian commentators thought of those people as Christians of Jewish background. They had no sense of Jewish community identity for most Christian scholars. And I studied a lot of them. that these people were not assumed to have any sense of Jewish communal cohesion anymore now that they believed in Jesus. There was only one scholar I found who agreed with my hunch. A fellow whom most of you have ever heard of, Charles P. Anderson. He taught religious studies at that time in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he wrote an article. And in that article, he challenges a lot of these assumptions. And I should have the name of that article for you folks today, but I don't. But I'll put it up on our Facebook page for those of you who want it when this podcast is broadcast that week. I'll put it up on the Facebook page. But at any rate, Anderson holds that the standard view of the letter is distorted due to the presuppositions and the Paul-colored glasses worn by Bible interpreters. As a matter of fact, the Old King James Bible used to say that the letter of the Hebrews was written by Paul, but nobody really believes that. It was not written by Paul. We don't know who it was written by. There are different theories, but it was not Paul. But people read the letter through the lens of Paul's concerns. And in fact, they don't read the letter. They misread the letter. And Anderson says this. I'm going to read a quote to you. He says this. Here we deal with questions such as the following. Does the community envisioned in Hebrews keep the whole Torah or part of it? What is the relationship in Hebrews between covenant, the people, and the Torah? In other words, in the letter to the Hebrews, we're asking all Jewish questions. The Gentiles are not even mentioned. I mean, people don't even imagine this. The Gentiles are not mentioned in Hebrews, and we'll get back to that later on. To Anderson, I'm going to read you another statement. The only law that has been done away with or changed is the law that pertains to the sacrificial system. The recipients of the letter keep Torah, but something has changed. It's not that the Torah is gone. It's that the priesthood has been replaced by the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. Because Yeshua, the eternal high priest, has come, suffered and died, presents his sacrifice on our behalf, and he's our great high priest. Anderson states that the letter never makes nor assumes a wholesale onslaught against the law as such, nor against Judaism as such. End quote. Now let me tell you, you may think that this is unnecessary to say, but I tell you you're wrong. People assume that the letter to the Hebrews, and in fact the whole New Testament, has an onslaught against the law. Grace good, law bad.
Oh, I was taught that in a lot of churches.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Grace good, law bad. Jesus good, rabbis bad. Church good, synagogue expired. I don't believe any of that. That's why we have a podcast called Torah and Judaism Jesus. But Anderson, who's not a Jew, gets it. And he says that the letter never makes nor assumes a wholesale onslaught against the law as such, nor against Judaism as such. Indeed, I got to read a little more. In Hebrews, the author is not in any sense setting at variance Christianity over against Judaism. He doesn't impose one to the other. Rather, in the letter, Anderson sees the religion of the letter to the Hebrews as being, quote, oriented primarily, if not exclusively, to Jews. While, like the Essenes, the author of the letter opposes Temple Judaism in the strongest possible terms, nevertheless, the writer of the Hebrews is writing in a totally Jewish context. He thinks of the community as a Jewish community. The writer to the letter to the Hebrews thinks of the community as a Jewish community. They think of themselves as a Jewish community. They think of themselves as Torah-observant Jews. But they're asking, but he's talking about what has changed now that the Messiah has come. And the answer is the sacrificial system has been replaced. That's the only part of the law.
So the rest of the law still standing exists.
That's the assumption. Now, one of the passages that people point to is in Hebrews 7, verse 10. You've got that passage there. Would you read that first, Steve? Maybe you don't. He says, for when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. Right here.
Oh, sorry.
Would you read that?
But what Anderson points out is this. What is referred to in chapter 7, verse 12.
Read above that.
Okay.
Read the text again for the people who may be driving. When the priesthood?
For when the priesthood is changed, the law must also change.
Okay. Now people think of that text and they say, okay, that means the Old Testament law is gone, the New Testament law is in. New covenant, yes. Old covenant, no. But Anderson goes on to comment. Why don't you read?
What is referred to in chapter 7, verse 12 is the one elemental discontinuity permeating the epistle. The sacrificial and temple practice of Israel, its liturgical law, 8, 2, and 6, and only the liturgical law that is changed in Hebrews. Inferences concerning other aspects of Torah or the Torah as such are unwarranted.
Okay, this change in sacrificial law, Steve referenced to 8, 2, and 6. Let me read a little bit of chapter 8 that people throw at us all the time. Maybe not at you, but since I stand at the intersection of the Christian and Jewish worlds as a problem solver and consultant, I get this flung at me all the time. Chapter 8, verse 1 and 2. Now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up and not man. But as it is, verse 6, Messiah has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better. He mediates a better covenant, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need or occasion to look for a second. So we do have a new covenant, a new arrangement, but does that mean we have a new law? Not exactly. Anderson highlights how the church misreads Hebrews by reading it through Pauline glasses. And I'll ask you, Steve, to read again. Read this quote from Anderson.
The arguments in Hebrews regarding law and covenant are misunderstood if confused with Paul's argument concerning the incorporation of the Gentiles into faithful Israel. The religious world of Hebrews is narrower and more traditional than Paul's, with the one fundamental exception relating to the cult or the temple practice. Right? And that's the archaeological use of the word cult, not the... Anyway, the Torah is still valid for those to whom it was given by Moses.
The Torah is still valid for those to whom it was given by Moses. Huge statement. Keep reading.
Right. No break with Jewish tradition apart from priesthood, sacrifice, and temple is assumed in Hebrews. Discontinuity centers upon the cult, not Torah. Of course, cult implicates Torah, but
the temple sacrifices, and implicates Torah, to go on.
But Torah is a larger category, and apart from the priesthood and other cultic aspects, is left untouched by the critique of Hebrews. The new covenant does not imply a new Torah, but a changed Torah in which the earlier cultic legislation of sacrifice is replaced.
Whoa! Now I'll tell you, it's a remarkable article, and again, I'm sorry that I don't have the name for you here. When I post this podcast on my website, on Interfaithfulness website, and on our Facebook page, I will include the name of the article. But it's a remarkable article. And it's not just remarkable because I agree with it, because there's a man named Richard B. Hayes, who is one of the premier Bible scholars and expositors, not expositors so much, he's an exegete. He's a person who knows how to analyze the text of Scripture and unearth what it's saying to us. He's an exegete. He's one of the greatest of the 20th century. Richard B. Hayes used to hold the position that most Christians hold, that the letter to the Hebrews teaches that a new covenant has come in that has rendered the old covenant expired, rendered the Torah legislation expired, rendered Jewish life as a requirement or an expectation of Jews as expired. He used to hold that, and he taught that. And then in 2009, he wrote an article in which he begins by quoting from his former opinion. And he says, the guy who quoted those opinions was wrong, and that guy was me.
Whoa.
And let's talk about this a little bit. He He ran across Anderson's article, is what happened. The very same article that I ran across in my PhD. He ran across the same article. And he shows that some scholars have recently begun to question the supersessionist paradigm for reading Hebrews. And some scholars are proposing new models for understanding the text. So he says that I, Stuart Dauermann, I'm not alone, that he is not alone, and that Anderson is not alone in reconsidering the party line. He says a whole group of scholars, he named some of them, a woman named Gabriella Gialardini in her book Hebrews, Contemporary Methods, New Insights. She holds that a letter is a homily for Tisha B'Av, which is, at the time of this taping, is a few days away, a day for mourning the destruction of the two temples. And other people, like New Testament scholar Pamela Marie Eisenbaum, and other people are reconsidering the whole party line on Hebrews, that the Torah is expired now that the New Testament, the New Covenant has come. He quotes from a student of his who asked a question. The student said, if we lay aside our Pauline glasses and our assumptions that Judaism and Christianity were two polarized established camps at the time, and they weren't. They hadn't divided that way. So if we lay aside our false assumptions that these were two warring camps, is there anything that would lead one to conclude that the author of the letter to the Hebrews is anything other than a Jew weighing in on a controversy within his own religion? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing about the letter that is talking about an alternative religion to Judaism. It's an argument about what kind of Judaism do we have now that Yeshua has come.
Well, I'm not even sure, actually, that Christianity is not a part of Judaism, but that's a whole other discussion.
Well, it depends how you say it. You know, there's a fellow named George Lindbeck who speaks about the church and Gentiles in terms of being non-supersessionist Israel. That's an interesting phrase, but that's for another discussion. But getting back to Richard B. Hayes, he had the student ask the question, if you lay aside your Pauline glasses, stop reading it like it's written by the Apostle Paul, and if you lay aside the false assumption that these were two warring camps, Christianity and Judaism, the church on the corner, the synagogue on the corner, didn't exist. If you lay that aside, is there anything in the letter that would tell you that it's anything but a discussion about what kind of Judaism do we have now as Jews? And the answer is there's nothing that would contradict that. And that's what Hayes thinks we have. Once you ask that question, the corroboratory evidence is astounding. I'm going to ask you to read some material from Hayes, please.
Carrying out this experiment, we notice that the letter to the Hebrews nowhere speaks of Jews and Gentiles. Nowhere gives evidence of controversies over circumcision or food laws. Criticizes nothing in the Mosaic Torah except the Levitical sacrificial cult, and contains no polemic against Jews or Jewish leaders. Nowhere does Hebrews suggest that the Jewish people have been replaced by a new and different people of God. Indeed, it appears that the addressees of the letter are considered part of God's house, the same house over which Moses was faithful, that is, the house of Israel.
Keep going, please.
Okay. To pose the question whether Hebrews is supersessionist, then, runs the risk of imposing anachronistic categories on the text.
In other words, the letter to the Hebrews doesn't deal with the idea, has the church replaced Israel? That's not a discussion that existed in that community at that time. That's a later discussion. And when you interpret through that lens, you end up misunderstanding. Please continue reading.
Far from betokening a bailing out on the Torah and the Older Covenant, Hayes marks how Hebrews finds evidence for newness within texts acknowledged by Jews as authoritative. It is a newness from within rather than a newness from without.
So, in other words, and we believe this at Interfaithfulness, the coming of Yeshua was meant to be a renewal movement within Judaism.
Right.
Not a replacement for Judaism, not a new religion, a renewal movement within Judaism that would have implications for the The Jewish world, the Gentile world, and the whole cosmos. That's what it is. And here on our podcast, Toward a More Jewish Jesus, that's the kind of conceptual world that we inhabit. We have a few minutes. I want to give 8 ways. And I know this is a pretty intellectual discussion today. But for some of you, it's like water on dry ground because you've not been equipped to deal with these issues. But let me give you what Hayes says. He finds 8 ways in which this newness is highlighted. And I'm going to only give you 5 of them, and you can find the others at your leisure. First of all, he says, the revelatory message is spoken through a son who is ontologically, that is, in terms of his beingness, superior to the prophets and the intermediaries through whom the word formally came. So, God, who spoke in times past to our fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by a Son, whom he made the heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being, etc., etc., etc. So that's the newness. It's the newness of an elevated revelation. Number 2, the text of Scripture spoke of a later rest into which the Jewish people had not formally entered. Whatever blessing Israel may have received in the past remains provisional, looking to an eschatological future. So that's also a newness that in Yeshua we find the doorway opening to get a better peek at that future, that greater rest towards which the Jewish people have been aspiring all these years. Number 3, on the basis of Psalm 110, Messiah is a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, a status confirmed with an oath which came later. So that's a 3rd way in which there is a newness within Judaism. There's a new high priest. That's not unusual, by the way, in Judaism, to have new high priests. It happened all the time. But now we have an eternal high priest. Number 4, the earthly sanctuary is but a sketch and a shadow. Thus, the role of the earthly sanctuary was always designed as provisional, a temporary copy of the real thing. That's another way in which we have newness. We have a focus on the permanent, eternal tabernacle in the heavenlies, rather than on a series of temporary tabernacles and temples on earth. Number 5, he deals with chapter 8 of Hebrews and its commentary on Jeremiah 31, which many say declares kaput to the Torah and has the New Testament replacing it. Of this chapter, Hebrews says this, and this is where we're getting close to closing, because I want you to read one juicy quote at the end. He says, it is God's declaration of a new covenant that makes the old covenant old. It is a speech act, just as declaring some woman to be my new wife automatically says something about other women with whom I have been linked. So, by having a new covenant, it necessarily makes the one prior to it called old. It doesn't mean it's inferior. But if something is new, then what does it say about what came before it? So it's not a statement, it's not a pecking order. Number 2, the inadequacy of the older covenant was due to a fault in the people. It says in Hebrews, he found fault with them.
So there was no fault in the law.
Not a fault in the law, rather than with the older covenant itself. Because of this defect, the older covenant could not itself bring God's people to holiness. Quote, the inadequacy of the first covenant may be thought of to consist precisely in its inability to create an obedient people, end quote. It's not just law spoken of, but the whole arrangement, the whole way things work. The way things worked in the past, we had a law, and we were supposed to keep the law, but the law was perfect. Paul says the law is holy, just, and good. But the people were not perfect. And so the problem, where it broke down, was the disobedience of the people, not the defect in the law. So, God's solution is to create a new covenant in which he writes his Torah on his people's hearts. In this covenant, God is the actor who guarantees success. In the new covenant passage in Jeremiah, it says, behold, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not with the covenant which I made with their fathers, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband to them. But this will be the covenant that I'll make with them. I will write my Torah on their hearts. My Torah, not a different Torah. It's just a different way of achieving obedience to Torah. And finally, the author gives no indication that this covenant is meant for anyone but the house of Israel and Judah. Hebrews represents a kind of Jewish restoration eschatology, but it's a newness within Israel and not from the outside. So if you want to talk about a letter to the Hebrews, talk about a letter to the Hebrews. Don't go to passages in Colossians or passages in Galatians or passages in Romans to interpret Hebrews. First, let Hebrews speak for itself, and Hebrews speaks with a Jewish accent.
It certainly does.
Okay. So I find the following quote by Hayes to be of special importance, and with this I think we better close. Would you read this quote, please, Steve?
Mm-hmm. As we have already noted, the author of Hebrews is not interested in a blanket abolition of the Mosaic Torah. Rather, his concern focuses narrowly on the cultic practice of offering sacrifices for sins under the first covenant, particularly on the Day of Atonement, as Hebrews 9 shows. The new covenant instituted by Yeshua provides an alternative way for purification and atonement through Yeshua once and for all offering of his own blood. But to generalize the new covenant language of Hebrews 8 into a comprehensive negation of the Torah is to go far beyond anything found in the text.
Whoa. This is a big shot saying this. This is not a pipsqueak.
Not just us.
Yeah, read the end of that quote, please.
The cumulative force of these observations is to suggest that the classic New Covenant chapter in Hebrews has often been overinterpreted through a supersessionist hermeneutical framework. The possibility should be considered that Hebrews' use of the New Covenant image envisions not the rejection, but the restoration of Israel. If so, Hebrews 8 is less discontinuous with the original sense of Jeremiah 31 than later Christian interpreters have often supposed.
Amen. So there you are. And now I've got my final 2 cents, my 2 cents plain. Here at Interfaithfulness, which is the organization that sponsors Torah and Judaism, we are your consultants and problem solvers at the intersection of the Christian and Jewish worlds. Now, we offer solutions and we offer an analysis of what we think the problems are, but only you can tell us what are your problems living at the intersection of the Jewish and Christian worlds. How can we serve as your problem solvers? How can we serve as your consultants to assist you living as Jews, as Christians, even as intermarried couples at the intersection of the Christian and Jewish world? You can get in touch with us. Write to me, Stuart at interfaithfulness.org. That's Stuart, Stuart, at interfaithfulness.org. Or you can call us anytime at our phone number, which is 626, and if you can count backwards from 7, you can remember the number, 626-765-4359. 626-765-4359. Get in touch with us. What problems are you running into? How can we be your consultants at the intersection of the Christian and Jewish worlds? And we want you to remember that everything gets better
when people get together around a more Jewish Jesus.
Thanks a lot. Shalom for now.
You may support our work at Toward a More Jewish Jesus by sending your tax-deductible contributions to Interfaithfulness, P.O. Box 6137, Altadena, California 91003, 6137. That's Interfaithfulness, P.O. Box 6137, Altadena, California 91003-6137. Please make out your checks to Interfaithfulness. If you prefer donating on the web, please visit us at www.interfaithfulness.org and look for the donate button in the lower right corner of the page. We invite you to follow us too at our Interfaithfulness Facebook page. Thanks for joining us today at Interfaithfulness, where everything changes for the better when we move toward a more Jewish Jesus.